The chief neurologist took one look at the retired admiral in the wheelchair and said, "There's nothing left to treat. 19 years. That's how long Admiral Graham Callahan had been told. His legs were gone forever. 19 years of specialists, second opinions, and closed doors. Then a quiet ER nurse in a hospital nobody famous had ever heard of rolled up his sleeve, found a scar nobody else had bothered to look at, and stopped breathing for 3 full seconds. Because she knew exactly what that scar meant. And she knew the government had been lying about it for 2 decades. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories that make your jaw drop actually get told all the way through. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The ambulance bay doors at Cascade Valley Medical Center blew open at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, and the paramedics came through fast, the way they always did when something was already going wrong before they even arrived. Nora Whitaker was halfway through her 3rd cup of coffee, bad coffee, the kind that tasted like it had been sitting in the machine since the previous shift when she heard the radio crackle from the nurse's station. She set the cup down without finishing it. That was muscle memory. 11 years in emergency medicine had trained her body to abandon comfort the moment the frequency changed. Incoming transfer, the charge nurse called out. Veteran transport. 64-year-old male, quadriplegia, secondary infection suspected, stable vitals. Nora was already moving. The man in the wheelchair wasn't what she expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was broad across the shoulders in the way of men who had once been physically powerful, the kind of build that didn't entirely disappear even after years of immobility. His hair was white and cut close to the skull, military precise even now. His face had the particular stillness of someone who had learned to exist inside a body that no longer cooperated, not resignation, exactly, but a kind of enforced patience that calcified into something harder. His name was Graham Callahan. The transport paperwork listed him as a retired Navy admiral, which made Nora glance up from the clipboard, briefly. The paperwork also listed his injury date as nearly 2 decades prior, a spinal trauma sustained during what was described only as an operational incident in a classified theater of deployment. His spinal cord injury had been classified as complete at the C6 level. Complete, meaning total, meaning permanent. What's the secondary complaint? Nora asked the paramedic, a young woman with a bruise forming under her left eye from where she'd apparently caught an elbow on a previous call. Recurring UTI, possible early-stage pneumonia based on lung sounds during transport. The assisted living facility said he'd been declining for about 2 weeks. Nursing staff got worried when his O2 started dipping. Primary care physician switched 3 times in the last year. Current PCP is across town, not affiliated with this facility. Nora looked at the Admiral. He was watching her with dark eyes that didn't look like they belonged to a man who had given up on anything. "Good morning, Admiral Callahan. I'm Nora Whitaker. I'll be your nurse today." "Morning," he said. His voice was rougher than she'd anticipated, like a radio signal fighting interference. "They told me this hospital has a new neurology department." "We do." "Good." He didn't say anything else, but the way he said that single word carried the weight of a longer conversation he had clearly already had with himself. She got him settled into Bay 4, started the standard workup vitals, blood draw, urinalysis, chest x-ray, ordered, and was writing up the intake notes when Dr. Victor Hale appeared. Hale was the chief of neurology. He was also, by universal consensus among the nursing staff, the most difficult attending physician in the building. Not incompetent, she'd never say that, because it wasn't true. He was clinically sharp, kept current with the literature, and had a publication record that looked impressive in a frame. But he moved through the hospital the way certain men move through every room they entered, with the assumption that his presence elevated the space rather than simply occupied it. He picked up the tablet with Callahan's records, scrolled for about 45 seconds, and handed it back to back to Nora without looking at her. Get him stable, treat the infection, and arrange a discharge plan back to his facility. There's no neurological intervention indicated here. Nora kept her voice even. He's been experiencing some new symptoms. The transport notes mention Nurse Whitaker. Hale said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. The man sustained a complete spinal cord injury 19 years ago. There is no new neurological development occurring. Whatever his facility's nursing staff interpreted as new symptoms is almost certainly related to the infection. Treat the infection. He was already turning to leave. I'd like to do a physical assessment before we finalize a plan, Nora said. Hale paused. He turned back with the particular expression of a man who was deciding whether to spend energy on something he considered beneath him. By all means, he said. Assess away. And then he walked out. Nora pulled the curtain around Bay 4 and sat on the rolling stool across from Graham Callahan. She had his chart on the tablet in her lap, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at him. The doctor seems like a real treat, he said. He grows on you. Like mold, the corner of her mouth moved. How long have you been having the new symptoms? Callahan's jaw shifted slightly. The facility staff, they documented tingling. I told them to write it down about 6 weeks ago. They said it was probably phantom sensation, common with spinal injuries. Is that what you think it is? He looked at her for a long moment. I spent 19 years being told what my body was and wasn't doing. I know the difference between phantom sensation and something real. Nora nodded slowly. Can I do a physical exam? That's why I asked to come here. She started at the top, systematic, the way she'd been trained not just in nursing school, not just in 11 years of emergency medicine, but in the 3 years before all of that, when she had been someone else entirely. She checked his cranial nerve responses, his upper extremity function, his grip strength on both sides. She tested sensation at multiple dermatomal levels, watching his face as much as his body, calibrating his responses against his expressions. And then she moved to his neck. She was palpating the cervical region, standard assessment, nothing unusual about the motion, when her fingers found the edge of it. A scar, partially hidden beneath the hairline, at the back of his neck, old enough to have faded to near invisibility against his skin. She might have missed it entirely. Most people would have. She didn't miss it. Her fingers went still. The scar was roughly 4 centimeters long, positioned precisely over the C5-C6 junction, with the particular texture of a surgical incision made under controlled, intentional conditions. It wasn't the scar itself that stopped her. Spinal injury patients often had surgical scars. It was the shape, the specific pattern of the incision margins, the depth of the healed tissue beneath the surface, and most critically, the faint but unmistakable contour of something that should not have been there. A structure beneath the scar, small, deeply embedded, and absolutely deliberate. Nora Whitaker had last seen that particular configuration in a field research manual that had been stamped classic-like and locked in a DoD archive in 2009. She had written 3 sections of that manual herself. She sat back. Her face was composed. She had learned to keep her face composed under conditions considerably more extreme than this. Admiral Callahan, she said carefully, when you had your spinal surgery, the initial injury, after the operational incident, do you remember anything about the procedure? What they told you afterward? He studied her. Something shifted in his expression, not suspicion, exactly, but alertness. The eyes of a man who had been given bad news enough times to recognize when someone was working up to something. I was unconscious for most of it, he said. I woke up in a facility I didn't recognize. Military medical, but not standard. They told me the surgery had stabilized my spine and that the cord damage was irreversible. I asked questions. I was told the answers were above my current security clearance, which was, he paused, something dry moving through his voice, ironic, given my rank. Nora nodded slowly. Did anyone ever follow up with you, specifically about the surgical site at the back of your neck? The silence that followed lasted 5 full seconds. She counted them. No, he said. Should they have? Nora stood up. I need to make a call. I'll be back in 10 minutes. She didn't make a phone call. She went to her locker in the staff room, the one she'd been meaning to clear out for months, because nurses were always meaning to do things they never quite got around to, and she opened it and pushed past the spare scrubs and the running shoes she never used and the paperback that had been marking the same page since February. In the back, inside a padded case that looked like it held a blood pressure monitor, was something that most decidedly did not. It was small, gray-cased, with a rubberized exterior and a single digital readout. It had a serial number that no longer appeared in any active military inventory, because the program it belonged to had been officially decommissioned in 2009. She had kept it because she hadn't been sure she was done with it. 11 years later, standing in a hospital locker room in Spokane, she understood for the first time that she had been right. She carried it back to Bay 4 under her arm, still in its case. The morning rush was building around her 2 incoming MVAs being staged, a pediatric respiratory case, 2 bays down, the charge nurse calling out bed assignments in the clipped shorthand of controlled chaos. Nora moved through all of it without varying her pace. She pulled the curtain closed behind her. Callahan looked at the case in her hands and said nothing. I need to explain something to you, Nora said, and I need you to listen without reacting until I'm finished. He nodded once. Military acknowledgement. The scar on your neck isn't just a surgical scar from your stabilization procedure. There is a device embedded beneath it, a very specific device, part of a classified military research program that's studied experimental nerve conduction, bridging technology for spinal cord injuries. The program was called Project Heliodor. It was funded through a DoD research division and ran from approximately 2001 to 2009 when it was shut down. I know about it because I worked in the research division for 3 years before I left the Army. Callahan's face had gone very still, not blank still. The way a person gets still when they're processing something that is rearranging the furniture of their entire understanding of their own life. The device, Nora continued, was designed to bridge damaged sections of the spinal cord using an implanted microelectrode array and a proprietary nerve conduction medium. In the early trials, it showed limited but measurable function restoration in incomplete injuries. In cases where the cord damage was less severe than initially classified, she paused. The device could potentially enable significantly more restoration than any of those patients were ever told to expect. The silence in Bay 4 was so complete, she could hear the cardiac monitor beeping from 2 bays down. You're telling me, Callahan said slowly, that I might not be as paralyzed as they told me I was. I'm telling you that the tingling sensation you've been experiencing for 6 weeks is consistent with a device that has been dormant for nearly 2 decades, beginning to register activity. And I'm telling you, I would like your permission to test that with a peripheral stimulation assessment. He looked at the case in her hands. What is that? A companion device, a peripheral stimulator designed to interface with the implant. It's non-invasive. The stimulator is external. I would apply it to specific points on your lower extremities and see if the implant responds. And if it does, then you haven't lost as much as they told you. Another silence. Then, how long have you been carrying that thing around in your locker? 11 years. Why? Nora considered the question. It was a reasonable question. She had asked herself, on and off, for a decade. Because I didn't feel like I was done yet, she said. Come. Graham Callahan took a breath and let it out and said, do it. Nora had the stimulator out of its case and was calibrating the frequency settings when Dr. Victor Hale walked back into Bay 4. He stopped when he saw what was in her hands. "What?" he said, in the tone of someone who has arrived at a situation they immediately resent. "Is that?" "A peripheral neurostimulator. That is not hospital equipment." "No." "Then put it away." Nora didn't put it away. She looked up at him with the specific calm that came not from serenity, but from having already decided something. "Admiral Callahan has a surgical implant at his C5-C6 junction that I believe is an experimental nerve conduction bridge from a classified DoD research program. I want to test his peripheral response before we finalize a discharge plan." Hale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Callahan. Then he looked back at Nora with the expression of a man deciding how much of his time this was worth. "He has a complete spinal cord injury," Hale said. Each word landed separately, like he was explaining something to a slow student. 19 years documented. There is nerve conduction to test. There is nothing to bridge. The tingling he described is phantom sensation. It is clinically unremarkable in a patient with his injury profile. Then a 5-minute test will confirm that, Nora said, and I'll discharge him as planned. You're a nurse, Whitaker. Something sharpened in his voice. You don't administer experimental protocols with personal equipment on my patients. He's not your patient. He hasn't been assigned to an attending yet. The silence that followed had an almost physical quality. Put the device away, Hale said quietly. Or I will call the charge nurse, and we will have a very different conversation about your continued employment on this unit. Nora looked at him. She thought briefly about the 3 years she had spent in a classified research facility in Virginia, about the 14 patients she had personally monitored, about the morning she had driven into work and found the entire program dismantled overnight without a single goodbye or clinical handoff. She thought about what it meant to have been right about something for a very long time without being able to prove it. Then, let me prove you wrong in 6 minutes, she said. 6 minutes. Admiral Callahan has consented. If nothing happens, I'll discharge him myself, and we never speak of it again. Hale's jaw was tight. He looked at Callahan. Callahan looked back at him with the absolute, unhurried patience of a man who had nothing left to lose and knew it. 6 minutes, Hale said. The word tasted like a mistake he was making in real time. And you're documenting this as an unsanctioned personal assessment, not a clinical procedure. Fine. Hale crossed his arms and positioned himself against the far wall. Not leaving. Nora hadn't expected him to leave. Men like Hale never left when they thought they were about to be vindicated. She placed the first electrode pad at the lateral aspect of Callahan's left thigh, just above the knee. The second went at the anterior tibialis. The third at the dorsum of the foot. She had done this calibration so many times in a Virginia research facility that her hands moved without needing her full attention. She checked the frequency. She checked the amplitude. She looked at Callahan. You're going to feel a low-frequency pulse at the electrode sites, she said. It won't hurt. Tell me if you feel anything pressure, warmth, tingling, movement, anything at all. He nodded. She powered on the stimulator. For 4 seconds, nothing happened. Nora increased the amplitude by a single increment. Standard protocol. She was watching Callahan's face, watching for the micro-expressions that could tell her more than his words, and she saw it. A flicker. The particular tightening around the eyes of someone who has just received unexpected information from their own body. Left thigh, he said. Very quiet. Something. She increased the amplitude again. And Graham Callahan's left quadriceps contracted. Not a spasm. Not a random reflex. A voluntary adjacent, stimulus-driven muscular contraction. Clean and deliberate, exactly consistent with an active nerve conduction bridge responding to an external signal. From across the room, she heard Hale's intake of breath. She increased the amplitude 1 more increment and moved the signal to the lower leg. 3 seconds. 4. And then the calf. Unmistakable. A visible, sustained contraction of the gastrocnemius muscle on a leg that the United States Navy and 3 civilian neurologists and 19 years of medical consensus had declared permanently and completely non-functional. What? Callahan's voice was not steady anymore. What is that? That's I can feel the resistance. I can feel it pushing. Nora's hands were absolutely steady. Her voice was steady. Her face was steady. Everything about her was steady, except for the single thing she couldn't control, which was the fact that her eyes had gone wet, and she didn't have a free hand to do anything about it. She adjusted the electrode at the foot site, recalibrated, applied the signal. Graham Callahan's toes curled. The room was completely silent. She heard Hale push off the wall behind her. She heard him take 2 steps forward. She heard the sound of a man's certainty beginning to crack at its foundation. Callahan was staring at his foot. His jaw was working. He made a sound that wasn't a word, something raw and involuntary that belonged to a category of human expression that had nothing to do with language. "It's responding to the bridge," Nora said. Her voice was low and very careful because she was talking about more than one thing at once. "Your cord was never fully severed, Admiral. The implant was maintaining a pathway dormant, but intact. It's been intact for 19 years. Hale had reached the foot of the gurney. His face had undergone a transformation that she had seen before in men who had built their entire professional identity on being the smartest person in the room and suddenly found themselves in a room where that was no longer true. It was not a pleasant thing to watch. She watched it anyway. "That's not possible," he said. But the words had lost their authority. They were reflexive now, a defense mechanism rather than a clinical conclusion. "MRI will confirm it," Nora said. "Full spinal column, with particular attention to the C5-C6 junction. I want contrast imaging around the implant site." She was already reaching for the tablet. She was already writing the order. She knew he could block it. She also knew that he wasn't going to block it, because whatever else Victor Hale was, he was a physician who had just watched an impossible thing happen, and he was not capable of pretending he hadn't. Her hand was on the tablet when she felt it, the specific prickling awareness of being watched by more than one Merbrickson person. She looked up. The curtain to Bay 4 was slightly parted. On the other side of it, 3 nurses and a medical student stood in the controlled chaos of the ER, having collectively stopped what they were doing because word traveled fast in emergency departments, and something had just happened in Bay 4 that nobody had a category for yet. Nora met their eyes. Then she turned back to the tablet. "I'll need to speak with you privately," she said to Hale, without looking up from the order entry screen. "After the MRI, about something larger than this patient." Hale said nothing for a moment. "Then my office. 10 a.m. 10 a.m., she agreed. She finished entering the order. She put the tablet down. She looked at Graham Callahan. She looked at Graham Callahan, who was still looking at his own foot, with the expression of a man who had just been handed something back that he had grieved for long enough that he'd stopped believing he deserved to want it anymore. "The MRI will take about 40 minutes, she said. "I'll walk down with you." He looked up at her. His eyes were red at the rims. He didn't try to hide it. 19 years, he said. "I know. I asked questions. They said it was above my clearance." "I know that too." He looked at the peripheral stimulator, still connected, still powered on, the small digital readout glowing in the fluorescent light of Bay 4. "You kept that thing in your locker for 11 years. "Yes. You knew someone might walk in here with this implant." Nora thought about the honest answer. It was complicated, the way honest answers usually were. "I knew the patients from that program existed," she said. "I knew they'd been discharged without follow-up. I knew the device had a theoretical lifespan much longer than the program's official documentation acknowledged." She paused. "I hoped. Professionally." Callahan made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been carrying so much weight. "Hope," he said. "Professionally. It's a valid clinical tool." The orderly appeared at the curtain with the transport chair. Nora began detaching the electrode pads, careful and methodical, rolling the leads and fitting everything back into the padded case. She latched it. She held it in her hand for a moment. Then she put it in the pocket of her scrub top rather than back under her arm. Because she wasn't finished with it yet. Graham Callahan was transported to radiology at 8:14 a.m. The MRI suite was on the second floor, and Nora walked beside the transport chair through the corridor and into the elevator. And neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need to be filled, because what had just happened in Bay 4 was larger than anything either of them had the language for yet. The elevator doors opened on the second floor. Ahead of them, the corridor stretched toward radiology, and through the window, at the far end, the morning was still early enough that the sun was still low and the light it threw across the linoleum was almost golden. Nora walked beside the wheelchair. Behind her, in the ER she had just left, Doctor. Victor Hale was making a phone call. She didn't know yet what he was saying. She would find out. She already understood, with the particular clarity that came from having lived through one version of this situation before, that the next several hours were going to be significantly harder than the last. She kept walking. The Admiral's toes had moved. Everything else was secondary. The radiology suite smelled like cold air and industrial cleaner, and Graham Callahan said nothing when the MRI technician helped transfer him to the scanning table. But his jaw was set in a way that told Nora he was working hard to hold something together that wanted very badly to come apart. She waited in the observation room. Through the glass, she watched the table slide him into the bore of the machine, and she watched the tech run the initial positioning sequence, and she thought about numbers. 19 years, 14 patients in the original Heliodor cohort. 3 years of her own life given to a program that had been disassembled in a single weekend while she was at home, not sleeping, drinking bad coffee that was marginally better than the hospital's, waiting for a follow-up call from her commanding officer that never came. The machine began to run. The sound of it, that rhythmic, industrial knocking, was not a sound she had ever managed to find comforting, despite years of professional proximity to MRI suites. It sounded like something trying to get out. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail. 20 seconds later, it buzzed again. Same number. She stepped out into the hallway and answered it. Whitaker. The voice on the other end was male, older, carrying the specific flatness of someone who had learned to remove all inflection from their speech as a professional habit. This is Colonel Marcus Dreyer, DoD Medical Affairs. We need to speak. Nora felt the hairs on her forearms stand up, the way they did when situation moved faster than she had prepared for. She kept her voice level. How did you get this number? We've been monitoring for specific device signatures in civilian medical facilities. Your stimulator activated this morning and triggered an automatic alert. A pause. I assume you understand what that means. It means your program is still watching, she said. 14 years after you shut it down. A longer pause. I'd like you to discontinue the patient assessment and transfer the Admiral's case to our facility. For minus. No. The word landed and sat there. Nurse Whitaker. I'm conducting a clinical assessment on a patient who presented to this ER with an active medical complaint. He's currently undergoing an MRI that I ordered based on physical findings. I'm not discontinuing anything. The technology involved is classified. The technology is implanted in a living person who was never told it was there. She could hear her own voice going quiet in the way it did when she was genuinely angry. Not performing anger, but feeling it at a level that was older and colder than the present moment. That person is my patient. Unless you have a court order or a direct federal mandate, this conversation is over. She ended the call. Her hands were completely steady. That was one of the things the Army had given her, the ability to be furious without her hands shaking. She wasn't sure it was a gift, exactly. She went back into the observation room. The MRI tech looked up when she came back in. You want the prelim? Please. He pulled up the sagittal views on the monitor, and Nora leaned forward, and then she stopped leaning because what was on the screen made her go very still in a way that was different from her earlier stillness. Different because the earlier stillness had been professional. This was personal. The implant was not just intact. It was structurally perfect. 14 years of dormancy should have degraded the electrode matrix. The biological interface material should have shown calcification, scarring, integration, artifacts of decades of physiological change. Instead, the device sat at the C5-C6 junction like something that had been placed there last month, clean margins, intact electrode array, the nerve conduction bridge polymer still showing its characteristic signal density against the surrounding tissue. And beneath it, undeniable on the contrast sequence, the spinal cord itself. Not severed, not destroyed. Compressed, yes. Damaged in ways that had produced real and lasting neurological deficits. But structurally present on both sides of the injury level, with visible tissue continuity that 19 years of medical documentation had simply, impossibly, failed to record. What am I looking at? The tech said, frowning at the screen. A very expensive mistake, Nora said, or a very deliberate one. She photographed the screen with her phone before she could think better of it. Then she thought better of it and photographed it again, from a different angle. She was back in the hallway, sending the images to her personal encrypted cloud account, a habit left over from 3 years in a classified research environment and when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened. And Dr. Zhang Hale stepped out with 2 men she didn't recognize. They were not wearing white coats. They were wearing what coats? They were wearing the specific variety of civilian clothing that was designed to look like civilian clothing while communicating that the people wearing it were not civilians. Dark jackets, pressed slacks, the kind of posture that didn't come from medical school. One of them was carrying a black laptop case. The other one was carrying nothing, which was somehow more concerning. Hale saw her, and the particular expression on his face told her everything she needed to know about the phone call he'd made while she was walking Callahan to radiology. He had called someone. Whatever he had said had produced these 2 men very quickly, which meant the number he had called had been prepared for exactly this situation. She tucked her phone into her scrub pocket and waited. Whitaker. Hale came to a stop a few feet from her. He was working very hard to project authority and managing it less convincingly than usual. This is Dr. Raymond Souza, and he gestured to the man without the laptop, his associate. They're from the Department of Defense Medical Research Division. They've asked to speak with you regarding the Admiral's case. Raymond Souza, Nora said. You were Deputy Program Director for Heliodor in 2007. Souza's face did not move. He was somewhere in his late 50s, silver-haired with the kind of face that would have been good-looking 20 years ago and was now just angular. You have a strong memory, Major Whitaker. I'm not a major anymore. No. He glanced at the radiology suite door behind her. Is he still in the machine? He'll be done in about 10 minutes. We'd like to review the imaging before it goes to the attending record. Nora looked at him. That's not how this works. Major. Nurse. Whitaker. She said it without heat, without the defensive edge that would have made it sound like she was correcting him rather than simply stating a fact. Admiral Callahan is a patient at this hospital, and his imaging is part of his protected medical record. If you want to review it, you'll need his written consent and a formal records request. I'd suggest starting with the hospital's legal department. This situation involves classified military technology. The classified military technology is inside a patient who I'm legally and ethically obligated to treat. She looked at Hale. Dr. Hale, has the hospital's legal counsel been notified about the nature of the Admiral's presentation? Hale looked like a man standing on ice he had not tested first. I was in the process of determining the appropriate, and I'll take that as a no, Nora said. I'll make that call myself. She looked back at Souza. You're welcome to wait in the lobby. You're welcome to wait in the lobby. When Admiral Callahan's imaging is complete and he's been informed of the results by his clinical team, he can decide whether he wants to speak with you. Souza held her gaze for a long moment. His associate, the one without the laptop, had not looked away from her since they'd gotten off the elevator. She did not look at him because she understood that looking at him was what he was waiting for. You understand, Souza said quietly, that what you've activated this morning has implications that extend well beyond this hospital. I know exactly what I've activated, Nora said. I helped design it. She turned and went back into the observation room. Her heart was doing something irregular that it was going to have to sort out on its own. The MRI ran for another 8 minutes. When Graham Callahan came out of the bore and was assisted back to the transport chair, Nora was there, and she sat across from him in the small consultation space adjacent to the suite and showed him the images on the tech's monitor. She had the tech pull them up on the portable display rather than sending them to the main record yet. Buying time she needed to think, a choice she was aware she would have to answer for later and had made anyway. Callahan looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. He was a man who had spent 20 years learning to read imaging of his own spine, the way that people who live inside a medical reality eventually absorb the visual language of it, whether they intend to or not. She didn't have to explain what she was showing him. The cord is intact, he said. Not a question. Structurally, yes. There's significant historical damage. The compression injury from the original trauma caused real neurological impairment. And not all of that is reversible. I want to be honest with you about that. But the implant was designed to work around that kind of damage, not through it, and based on what I saw with the stimulator this morning. How much? He cut through the clinical framing with the directness of a man who had learned that clinical framing was frequently a way of managing expectations downward. How much function are we actually talking about? Nora took a breath. I can't give you a number. Not yet. Recovery from this kind of long-term disuse combined with the specific nature of your injury, it would require intensive rehabilitation, time, consistent stimulation therapy. There are variables I can't assess from imaging alone. But the fact that the device is intact and the cord is continuous. She paused, looking for the right way to say the thing that was true without making it sound like more than it was. That's the foundation. Everything else is work. He was quiet for a moment. Then there were others in the program. Yes, what happened to them? Nora had known this question was coming and had still not fully prepared for it. When the program was discontinued, the patients were transferred back to their individual care facilities and notified that the experimental protocol had concluded. They were given standard follow-up documentation and discharged from the research track. There was no she stopped, started again. There was no clinical handoff. No one explained the implant's continued presence. No one told them the devices were still potentially functional. They were just sent back. Callahan absorbed this without visible reaction for about 4 seconds. Then, how many? 14 in the primary cohort. I don't know their current status. Some of them would be the program ran from 2001. The patients ranged in age. Some of them may not still be living. But some of them might still be sitting in wheelchairs with a working device in their neck. She didn't answer that. She didn't have to. He looked at his hands in his lap, the hands that worked, that had always worked, that had gripped a wheelchair for 19 years, and he said nothing for a while. Then he said, "There are 2 men in the hallway outside who I assume are not here to apologize." Nora looked at him. "You saw them?" "I was transported past them on the way out." His voice was dry. "I've been in enough rooms with DoD liaisons to recognize the posture." Raymond Souza. He was deputy director of the Heliodor program. Callahan's eyes went to a different place for a moment, somewhere internal, somewhere old. Souza, he said. I remember that name. From the initial surgery briefing. There was a name I overheard in the facility I woke up in. I was told it wasn't relevant to my care. It wasn't at the time. Nora kept her voice even. It's very relevant now. She helped transfer him back to the transport chair. He had more upper body strength than many of her spinal injury patients. Years of adaptation, having built his arms and shoulders into something approaching functional independence, and she walked beside him down the corridor toward the elevator. Souza and his associate were gone from the hallway. That was not reassuring. People like Souza didn't leave. They repositioned. Back in the ER, the morning had progressed into its full mid-shift chaos. 3 new arrivals. A bed management crisis on the medical floor that was backing up admissions. The charge nurse, wearing the expression of a woman who was carrying more administrative weight than she had been hired to carry. Nora navigated all of it by muscle memory, returning Callahan to Bay 4, updating the vitals in the system, starting the IV antibiotic for the UTI, because whatever else was happening, the infection still needed treating. She was hanging the antibiotic bag when her charge nurse, Deborah Okonkwo, 17 years of ER experience, the memory of an elephant, and a distrust of administrative interference that bordered on institutional, appeared at the curtain. "I need a minute," Deborah said. Nora finished hanging the bag, checked the flow rate, and stepped outside the bay. "2 things," Deborah said, in the low, rapid tone she used when she was managing information she didn't want the whole floor to hear. First, risk management called. Someone flagged an unsanctioned procedure in Bay 4 this morning. I told them I had no information on that. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Second, there's a woman at the front desk asking for you by name. Not as a patient, by name. She says she's a journalist. Nora closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. What outlet? She said she freelances. She had a press credential, but I couldn't read the outlet name from the desk. She's been there about 20 minutes, and she's very patient, which I find more alarming than if she were making a scene. I'll deal with it. Nora. Deborah caught her arm, briefly, with the grip of someone who meant it. What is going on in that bay? Nora looked at her. Deborah Okonkwo had covered her back on 3 separate occasions. In the past 18 months, once when a family member of a patient had filed a complaint that was entirely fabricated, once when a supply error had nearly cascaded into something serious, and once when Nora had simply needed someone to take her last 2 patients of a 12-hour shift so she could sit in the staff bathroom for 6 minutes without being needed by anyone. She owed Deborah a level of honesty she couldn't entirely provide yet. There's a veteran in Bay 4 who was abandoned by a government program, she said. I'm trying to fix it. Deborah looked at her for a long moment. Is this going to become a situation? It already is one. Right. Deborah released her arm. I'll cover your other 2 patients for the next hour. Go talk to the journalist. And, Nora, she paused, don't say anything you can't unsay. The journalist's name was Priya Vasanthan. She was in her mid-30s, compact and self-contained, with a voice recorder visible in the front pocket of her jacket and the specific quality of alertness in her eyes that distinguished people who asked for a living, asked questions, from people who simply asked questions. She had a small notebook open on her knee, already half filled, which told Nora she had been doing background work before walking into the hospital. They sat in a family consultation alcove off the main waiting area, semi-private, not private. A distinction Nora was aware of as she took the chair across from Vasanthan. I'm going to tell you up front that I'm not in a position to comment on any specific patient, Nora said. I know, Vasanthan said. I'm not here about a specific patient. I'm here about Project Heliodor. The name in a stranger's mouth in a hospital waiting room in Spokane was so dissonant that Nora spent a full half-second simply processing it. Where did you hear that name? I've been working this story for 8 months. Vasanthan's voice was unhurried and specific. I have documentation from 2 former DoD research staff, 1 congressional staffer who worked on the oversight subcommittee during the program's operational period, and a family member of a former patient who died in 2018, a veteran who never received follow-up care after the program was discontinued, and whose estate is now questioning the cause of his death. Nora said nothing. I'm not here to burn you, Vasanthan said. I'm here because this morning, a specific device signature appeared in a hospital in Spokane that corresponded to one of the implants from the Heliodor cohort and my source at the monitoring facility. Yes, they have a monitoring facility. Yes. It's still active, told me the DoD sent a response team within 40 minutes. She paused. I want to know if the patient is alive and whether someone at this hospital is trying to help him. Nora sat with that for a moment, the weight of 8 months of investigative work, sitting across from her in a waiting room alcove. A dead veteran, a monitoring facility that had been watching for device signatures for 14 years. I can't confirm anything about a current patient, Nora said. Legally. You understand that? I do. I can tell you, hypothetically, that if someone had activated a Heliodor device this morning and the DoD had already sent personnel to this hospital, that person would need to be very careful about what gets documented in the official record and what gets documented elsewhere. Vasanthan's pen moved across the notepad, and hypothetically, if that person needed a place to document things elsewhere, hypothetically, they would want to work with someone who had already been building a verified documentary record for 8 months and had existing source relationships with congressional oversight. They looked at each other. I need something, Vasanthan said. Not a patient name, not clinical information, but something I can take back to my editor to keep this open. Nora thought about the photographs on her phone. She thought about a dead veteran in 2018. She thought about 13 other people, those who were still living, sitting in wheelchairs, or in assisted living facilities, or in the specific diminished geography of permanently disabled lives, with a device at the back of their necks that nobody had ever told them might still be working. She took her phone out of her pocket. She opened the photo she had taken in the MRI observation room, not the patient's image, not anything identifiable. Just the implant, isolated in the contrast sequence. The electrode array glowing clean and intact against the darkness of surrounding tissue. She turned the phone around. Vasanthan leaned forward. Something happened in her face. Not surprise, she was past surprise on this story, but a kind of sharp, focused settling, like a lens finding focus. Is that what I think it is? She said. It's not a patient image, Nora said. It's a device. In a body, functioning, after 14 years of supposed dormancy, post a program that was officially closed on the grounds that the technology was non-viable. Vasanthan was already reaching for her recorder. Nora put her hand briefly over the woman's wrist, not stopping her, just interrupting her. Not here, Nora said, and not yet. I need 48 hours. What happens in 48 hours? Either this goes through proper clinical and legal channels with the hospital's full institutional backing, or she paused. I give you everything. Vasanthan held her gaze for a long moment. Then she put the recorder back in her pocket and wrote something on the notepad, her number, her encrypted messaging app handle, the name of an attorney she worked with, who specialized in whistleblower cases, and tore the page out and handed it across. Nora folded it and put it in her pocket with the note from Colonel Dreyer's voicemail that she had transcribed while waiting in radiology. She stood up. Vasanthan stood with her. One more thing, the journalist said. The family of the veteran who died in 2018, his name was Robert Tanner, 62, former Army Ranger, Heliodor, patient number 11. His daughter has been trying to get his medical records amended for 3 years, but she's been told repeatedly that his death was unrelated to his injury management. She paused, and Nora recognized the particular precision of someone delivering information in the exact order it would land hardest. His autopsy noted the presence of an unidentified spinal implant that the medical examiner couldn't account for. The implant was removed and logged as evidence in a case that has since been classified. The waiting room was loud around them. Someone's child was crying near the vending machines. The overhead PA called a code for a different floor. The ordinary machinery of a busy hospital running its ordinary morning. Nora stood in the middle of it and felt the full shape of the thing she had walked into. Not just Graham Callahan, not just 14 patients. A dead man, a classified autopsy, an implant in an evidence locker somewhere, in a case that someone had sealed. She had known on some level she had not let herself fully inhabit that the Heliodor program's closure had been wrong. She had known it the way you knew things that couldn't be verified, that lived in the body rather than the mind, a certainty that had no documentation, but that she had carried for 11 years like the peripheral stimulator in its padded case. Not quite ready to put it down. She was ready now. She walked back through the ER without looking toward the front entrance, where she was reasonably certain Sousa's associate was now stationed, and she went to Bay 4, and she pulled the curtain, and she found Graham Callahan sitting exactly as she had left him, the antibiotic running into his IV, his hands in his lap, his eyes on the middle distance with the focused inward tension of a man processing a radical revision of his own history. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about another patient from your program." He looked at her. She sat down on the rolling stool and told him about Robert Tanner. She watched it move through him, the information finding its way into a man who had been a naval officer, who had commanded other people and been responsible for other lives, and who had spent 19 years being systematically managed rather than treated. She watched him process it not as a patient, but as something older, the part of him that had operated on accountability and consequence, the part that had never been paralyzed. When she finished, the silence lasted longer this time. "They knew," he said. His voice was different now. Not raw the way it had been in the MRI suite. Harder. "They've known the whole time. The monitoring facility has been active. That means someone has been watching the device signatures for 14 years. Watching and not acting. Watching and not acting," he repeated. The words had a particular quality in his mouth, like something he was testing the weight of. "Tanner was number 11. You knew him?" "I knew of him. We weren't in the program together. The cohort was compartmentalized. Patients didn't interact. But I received a notification through official channels when he died. It was framed as an administrative update." He paused. "I thought it was routine. I didn't know what to do with it." "You couldn't have." "No." He looked at his hands again. "But someone could have. Someone who knew what the notification actually meant." The implication landed in the room between them, and neither of them moved to address it directly. Because some things didn't need to be said once you had been sitting in the same reality long enough to share its shape. Nora's pager went off. She looked at it. The extension was Hale's office. She stood up. "I'll be back. Whitaker." Callahan's voice stopped her at the curtain. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen before in people who had spent a long time feeling entirely alone inside a situation and had just discovered they weren't. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated than gratitude relief loaf, mixed with grief, mixed with the particular alertness of someone who had just decided to fight. "What do you need from me?" She thought about it for a real moment. Not a reflexive clinical answer, an actual answer. "Tell me everything you remember about the facility where you woke up after surgery," she said. "Every detail. When I come back." She walked out of the bay. Down the corridor, past the nurse's station, where Deborah met her eyes and gave a small, tight nod that meant things were holding for now, toward the elevator that would take her up to Hale's office, where she was going to have a conversation that she understood would determine whether this hospital stood behind her or handed her over. She pressed the button. The elevator opened. Inside it, standing with his hands clasped in of him and his expression composed in the careful way of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, was Raymond Sousa. He was alone. No laptop case. No associate. Just a man in a dark jacket in an elevator, with the look of someone who had decided to stop being subtle. "Dr. Sousa," Nora said, "Major Whitaker." He held the door open with one hand. "I think we both know this conversation is overdue." She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed behind her. The elevator moved upward, and neither of them spoke for the first 2 floors. Sousa was standing with his back to the rear wall, which was not the natural position of a man who had gotten into an elevator to ride it somewhere. It was the position of a man who had staged an encounter and wanted her to feel the staging. Nora stood facing the doors and watched the floor numbers change and let him have the silence, because she had learned a long time ago that the person who broke a silence first was usually the one who needed something from the other. He broke it on the 3rd floor. "You were one of the best researchers in the program," he said. "I want you to know I mean that without condescension. Your work on the biological interface matrix was genuinely significant. And then the program was discontinued, and I was sent home without a phone call," Nora said. "So forgive me if the compliment lands a little flat. The discontinuation was a funding decision. You know that." "I know what we were told." She kept her eyes on the floor numbers. "I also know that a functioning monitoring infrastructure costs money, and someone has been paying for it for 14 years. That's not a funding problem. That's a priority problem." Sousa was quiet for a moment. The monitoring was a liability management protocol, not ongoing research. Liability management. She let the word sit for a second. Robert Tanner's autopsy report was classified. "Is that also liability management?" The elevator stopped on 5. The doors opened. No one was waiting. They closed again. "There are aspects of the program's closure that I'm not in a position to discuss in an elevator," Sousa said. "Then tell me what you are in a position to discuss." "Admiral Callahan's case needs to be transferred to a DoD medical facility. We have the equipment and the personnel to manage his rehabilitation properly." Nora turned and looked at him directly for the first time since the doors had closed. "He doesn't want to be transferred. His preferences are legally binding." She kept her voice flat and factual. "He's a competent adult. He has decision-making capacity. He has consented to treatment at this facility." She paused. "You can't take him." Sousa's face was controlled in the way of someone who had practiced control for so many years it had become architectural rather than active. But something moved behind it. Not quite frustration. Something older and more specific. The look of a man who had been managing a situation for a long time and could feel it beginning to exceed his management. "What is it you're trying to accomplish here, Major Whitaker?" The floor number read 7. Hale's office was on 7. She reached past Sousa and pressed the button for 8 instead. "Treatment," she said. "That's all. That's what I've been trying to accomplish since 6:47 this morning." The elevator arrived at 8. She stepped out into the administrative floor, which was quiet and carpeted and smelled like recycled air and printer toner. Sousa followed her out. "I need you to listen to me," he said, and his voice had shifted, not warmer but more direct, the performance of reasonableness stripped back to reveal something more genuinely urgent underneath. "There are people above my pay grade who are aware of what happened this morning. People who have a very strong interest in controlling the information environment around Heliodor. If you keep pushing this, if you bring in media, if you go to the hospital's board, if you involve congressional contacts, you will be in the middle of something that is significantly larger than one patient's rehabilitation." "I'm already in the middle of it," Nora said. "I've been in the middle of it for 11 years. I was just standing still. You could lose your nursing license." "On what grounds?" "Administering an unsanctioned procedure with non-hospital equipment, with the patient's full informed consent, witnessed by the chief of neurology." She stopped walking and turned to face him. They were standing in a wide corridor between 2 rows of administrative offices, most of them empty at this hour. "You would go after my license. For treating a patient. I'm telling you what other people will do. I'm trying to give you a way to step back from this with your career intact." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 14 patients. She thought about Priya Vasanthan's notebook, half filled with 8 months of verified documentation. She thought about Robert Tanner patient number 11, whose autopsy had been classified and whose implant was sitting in an evidence locker somewhere, and whose daughter had been trying to fix his record for 3 years. "Do you have children?" she asked. Sousa blinked. It was the first uncontrolled response she had gotten from him. "I don't see what. Robert Tanner had a daughter." She kept her voice entirely level. "She's been told her father's death was unrelated to his injury management. She's been told the implant found in his spine during autopsy was an anomaly that couldn't be identified. She's been working for 3 years to amend his record, and she's been shut down every time." She paused. "You managed that program. You know exactly what that implant was. You know exactly what it means that he died with it still in his body, and no clinical follow-up in the years preceding his death." Sousa's jaw was very tight. "Step back from this," he said. "I'm asking you." "I know you are," she said. "The answer is no." She turned and walked back toward the elevator. She could feel him standing in the corridor behind her, and she made herself not look back because looking back would have suggested she was uncertain, and she wasn't uncertain. She was frightened, which was a different thing entirely, and frightened was manageable. She pressed the button for 7. The elevator came. She rode it down 1 floor and walked to Hale's office with the particular evenness of pace that was not calm but was disciplined, the body doing what it had been trained to do while the mind processed the shape of a situation that was changing faster than she had prepared for. Hale's office was at the end of the neurology department corridor, past the resident's workroom and the attending's lounge and a bulletin board covered in outdated policy memos that nobody had bothered to take down. His door was half open. She knocked on the frame. "Come in." He was behind his desk. The desk was large and organized in the way of a man who equated visual order with professional credibility. Everything in its place, the journals stacked with their spines aligned. He did not look the way she had expected him to look. She had expected defensiveness, or the particular aggressive confidence of a man re-establishing authority, after having it briefly undercut. Instead, he looked tired. Not physically tired, it was something more internal, the look of someone who had spent the last 2 hours thinking about something they would have preferred not to think about. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "The MRI results," he began, and then he stopped and started differently. "I've looked at the imaging. And the cord is not fully severed," he said it flatly, like a man reading a verdict he disagreed with but could not contest. "There is continuous tissue from the injury level. The compression damage is real and significant, but the structural continuity," he stopped again. "I've been a neurologist for 22 years. I have never seen a presentation like this in a complete injury classification." "Because the classification was wrong," Nora said. "Or it was made to be wrong." He looked at her sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't know yet whether the original injury assessment was a clinical error or a deliberate misclassification. But I know the monitoring facility has been active for 14 years. I know a DOD response team arrived at this hospital within 40 minutes of the device activation this morning. And I know that a patient from the same program died in 2018 with the implant still in his body and no follow-up care in the preceding years." She kept her eyes on him. "That's not a funding problem. That's not administrative oversight. That's a pattern." Hale was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she began to hear the ordinary sounds of the department around them, the phone at the nurse's station, the rolling of a medication cart in the corridor, the distant rhythm of a hospital in the middle of its working day. "I made a call this morning," he said, "before I came down to radiology with Sousa. I know. I called the hospital's risk management director." He paused. "Not the DOD. I want to be clear about that. I called risk management because I was uncertain about the liability implications of an unsanctioned procedure, and I wanted guidance." Another pause. Risk management then apparently called someone else. "I don't know who. I didn't authorize contact with outside parties." Nora considered this. It was possible. It was also possible. It was a more carefully constructed version of events designed to position him on the right side of a line he had only recently identified. She didn't know him well enough to be certain which it was, and that uncertainty was itself a kind of information. "I need to know where you stand," she said. "Not where you were this morning. Where you are right now." Hale looked at his desk for a moment. Then he looked at her. "The imaging is what it is. If the cord is intact and the device is functional, this patient deserves proper assessment and a real rehabilitation plan." He stopped. "That's not complicated from a clinical standpoint. It's everything around it that's complicated. The hospital needs to involve its legal counsel," Nora said, formally, "today. And we need to issue a hold on any records requests from outside parties until counsel has reviewed the situation. I can initiate that. I also need you to formally document your clinical observations from this morning. The stimulator response, the muscle contractions, what you witnessed. In the patient record, with a timestamp." Something moved across his face. She watched him calculate the professional risk of documenting what he had seen against the professional risk of not documenting it, and having it come out later that he had been present and had said nothing. "All right," he said. She stood up. "One more thing. The DOD personnel who came in this morning, they're going to try to have Callahan transferred. He's refused. If anyone from administration or from outside this hospital attempts to override his treatment decisions, I need you to support his right to remain here as a patient." "On what basis do you expect me to?" "On the basis that you're his attending physician as of this morning." She met his eyes. "You walked into that bay. You witnessed the assessment. That makes you part of his clinical team, whether either of us planned it that way." She paused. "It also means you're protected by his treatment record. As long as he's your patient and his care is properly documented, you have a legitimate clinical basis to resist any unauthorized transfer attempt." He understood what she was telling him. She could see it in the way his expression shifted, not gratitude, not quite, but the recognition of someone who had been given a way to stand on the right side of something by making it professionally rational, rather than purely moral. "I'll formally take the case," he said. She left his office and went back to the ER. The next 3 hours had the quality of a controlled burn, everything moving, nothing yet out of control, but the smell of smoke everywhere. She treated Callahan's UTI, monitored his vitals, and spent 40 minutes in the bay with him while he told her about the facility where he had woken up after his surgery. He had an admiral's memory, specific, detail-oriented, organized by operational logic rather than emotional sequence. The facility had been located outside of conventional military base infrastructure, accessed by a road that he estimated was approximately 40 minutes from a commercial airport based on the ambient air traffic noise. The surgical team had included at least 2 civilians, identified only by first names. The post-operative briefing had been conducted by a man in military uniform, whose rank, insignia Callahan, had been too sedated to read clearly, but who had used the phrase program integrity twice in the course of a 5-minute conversation. She wrote everything down in a notebook she had borrowed from the unit clerk, longhand, not in any electronic system connected to the hospital network. At 12:40 p.m., the hospital's legal counsel, a woman named Adrian Forsyth, who moved through the building with the energy of someone who ran on competence and black tea, arrived in the ER and asked to speak with Nora and Hale together. They used the family consultation room, the same one where Nora had spoken with Vasanthan that morning, and it felt smaller for the 3 of them. Forsyth had reviewed the situation. In the 2 hours since Hale's call to risk, management had triggered her involvement, which in Nora's estimation meant she had reviewed it thoroughly. Because Forsyth was not a woman who did things partially. She had a folder. The folder contained printed versions of the hospital's obligations under HIPAA, federal patient rights statutes, and a very specific section of the Uniform Code of Military Justice relating to the medical treatment of active and retired service members in civilian facilities. The short version, Forsyth said, is that Admiral Callahan has the full rights of any civilian patient in this facility. He cannot be transferred without his consent. His medical records cannot be released to outside parties without his authorization or a court order. Any attempt by DODD personnel to access him or his records without going through proper legal channels is actionable. She paused. The longer version is that the presence of classified military technology in a patient's body, implanted without his full informed consent regarding its long-term function and monitoring, is a significant legal issue that extends well beyond this hospital, and I am recommending that we place this situation formally before the hospital board today. The board meets Thursday, Hale said. I'm recommending an emergency session, Forsyth said. Today, Hale looked at Nora. Nora looked at Forsyth. What do you need from me for that? A full clinical statement. Everything you observed this morning, everything the imaging shows, and everything you know about the program the device came from in your capacity as a former research participant, not as the patient's nurse. Forsyth paused. I also need to know if you have any documentation from your time in the program. Nora thought about the research manual sections she had written. Classified, archived, technically government property. She thought about the peripheral stimulator in her pocket. Technically government property as well, though it had been left in property as well, though it had been left in her personal effects when the program was shut down with a haste that had precluded proper inventory. Some, she said. Bring it. The emergency board session was scheduled for 4 p.m. Nora had 3 hours. She used the first hour to complete Callahan's nursing documentation. Thorough, precise clinical language that described observable facts and excluded speculation, the kind of charting that would survive legal scrutiny because it was constructed to. She used the second hour to write her clinical statement for Forsyth, longhand first, then typed on a hospital computer she had logged into under her own credentials, because she wanted her name on every keystroke. She was in the middle of the third hour, reviewing what she had written, when her phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Vasan Than. Congressional staffer I mentioned wants a call with you tonight. This is moving faster than I expected. Are you still in? She stared at the message for a moment. Then she teed back, yes. She put the phone down and looked at the wall of the staff room and thought about the word still, which implied a prior commitment, which was technically accurate because she had committed to this the moment she had looked at the stimulator case in her locker and decided to carry it to Bay 4 instead of leaving it behind one more time. She was still in. She was in the board meeting by 4:08 after a 7-minute delay caused by 2 board members dialing in remotely and a technical issue with the conference system that a medical student resolved by unplugging and replugging a single cable. The board had 12 members. 9 were present in the room, 2 on video, 1 absent. The chair was a man named Theodore Burwell, late 60s, former surgeon, the kind of institutional authority that had calcified into something both inflexible and, when properly motivated, immovable. Forsyth opened. She was precise and thorough and positioned the hospital's liability before the ethical dimension, which was tactically correct the board would. Engage with risk before they engaged with principle. By the time she handed it to Nora, the room was already serious. Nora spoke for 11 minutes. She did not use notes after the first 2 minutes. She described the clinical findings, the imaging, the stimulator response, the conversation with Sousa in the elevator, the death of Robert Tanner, and the existence of 13 other patients who had never been followed up. She spoke without dramatics, without elevation, without reaching for language that was larger than the facts. The facts were large enough on their own. When she finished, the room was silent for 4 seconds. Then one of the board members, a woman in her 50s, named Dr. Patricia Lennox, who was on the board as a patient advocate representative, said, "You're telling us this hospital currently has a patient who was implanted with experimental military technology without his full informed consent monitored without his knowledge for 14 years, and that there are potentially 12 other living individuals in the same situation. Yes, Nora said, and that a D official arrived at this hospital this morning and asked you to stop treating him. Yes. Lennox looked at Burwell. Burwell looked at Forsyth. Something passed between the three of them that had the quality of an institutional decision, crystallizing in real time. We're issuing a formal hold on any unauthorized access to this patient, Burwell said. Legal will draft the communication to DOD by end of day. And I want a full clinical team assembled for the Admiral's case by tomorrow morning: neurology, physiatry, and physical therapy. He looked at Hale. Your department, Victor. Hale nodded. He looked at Nora briefly, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not apology. It's something more complicated than apology. The look of a man beginning to understand that what was happening in his hospital was larger than his assessment of it had been at 7 a.m. The meeting ended at 5:23 p.m. Nora was walking out of the boardroom when her phone buzzed again. Not Vasanthon this time. An unknown number, different from Dreyer's earlier call. She answered. Whitaker. A woman's voice. Older, measured, with the cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. My name is Senator Darlene Marsh. I chair the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee on Veterans Medical Oversight. I've been briefed on the situation at Cascade Valley Medical Center. I'd like to speak with you directly. Nora stopped walking in the middle of the corridor. Around her, the hospital continued its end-of-shift transition, the evening staff arriving, the day staff handing off, the particular organized exhaustion of a medical facility turning over its personnel for another cycle. Normal, the ordinary infrastructure of care. Senator, she said. How did you get my number? From Priya Vasanthon's congressional contact, Marsh said. Who is, for the record, my chief of staff. A pause. I've been watching Heliodor for 3 years. Nurse Whitaker. I've been waiting for something I could move on. A living patient with a functional implant and a documented clinical presentation. She paused again. That's something I can move on. Nora's hand was steady on the phone. Her heart was doing the thing again. I need you to understand what happens next if we bring this to the floor, Marsh continued. It will not be quiet. It will not be contained. The DOD will push back, and they will push hard, and your name will be in the middle of every report. I need to know if you can withstand that. Nora looked down the corridor. At the end of it, past the nursing station and the medication room and the supply closet she had restocked twice in the past week because someone always forgot, was the door to Bay 4. And behind that door was Graham Callahan. Yes, she said. Good. Marsh's voice shifted slightly, not warmer, but more direct. I'm flying into Spokane tomorrow morning. I'd like to meet with you and the Admiral together. I'll need to confirm with him, of course. One more thing. The senator's voice was level and precise. I've been informed that Colonel Marcus Dreyer placed a call to the DOD General Counsel's office approximately 40 minutes ago. He is requesting an emergency classification review that would allow them to restrict the Admiral's medical communications on national security grounds. The hallway felt very still around her. Can they do that? Nora asked. They're going to try, Marsh said, which is why I need you to ensure that the Admiral's full account, his recollection of the surgical facility, the personnel involved, every specific detail is in a protected record outside the hospital system before midnight tonight. Nora thought about the notebook. Longhand. Graham Callahan's Admiral's memory, specific and detailed, and currently sitting in the breast pocket of her scrub top. How protected? She asked. Attorney-client privilege protected. Forsyth at your hospital can facilitate. She'll understand what I mean when you tell her it's time-sensitive. All right, Nurse Whitaker. The senator's voice was even and completely serious. What you did this morning, what you've been carrying for 11 years matters. I want you to know that someone above the hospital level has known that for longer than today. Nora didn't respond to that because there wasn't a response that didn't require more emotional than she currently had available. I'll see you tomorrow, she said, and ended the call. She stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked back toward Bay 4, and she was 3 steps from Callahan's curtain when Deborah appeared at her elbow with the expression of someone delivering information under controlled duress. "There's a problem," Deborah said, low and fast. "What kind?" "The kind that just walked in through the ambulance bay." Deborah's voice was very controlled. "2 military police officers. They're at the admissions desk. They're asking about the Admiral." Nora went still. "They have paperwork," Deborah said. "It has a federal seal. I haven't let them pass the desk, but they're saying, 'Dix, get Forsyth,'" Nora said. "Right now. Tell her it's the classification review. She'll know." Deborah was already moving. Nora turned toward Bay 4. She pushed through the curtain. Callahan looked up at her from the bed, and whatever was in her face told him immediately that something had changed. "They're here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Military police. At admissions." She was already moving to the window terminal in the bay, pulling up his record, because she needed to verify that what she was about to do was documented correctly before she did it. "They have paperwork with a federal seal. I don't know yet if it's enforceable. If it's a classification order, it's not signed by a judge," she said. "Forsyth is on her way." She looked at him. "They cannot physically move you without your consent unless it's a lawful court order. That's not a classification instrument. That's a Title 18 issue, and it requires judicial authorization." He looked at her with the steady, assessing look of a senior officer evaluating a junior officer's tactical read under pressure. "You're certain?" 80%. "I've gone to war on worse odds," he said. She pulled up his nursing notes and added a time-stamped entry. "Patient reports no desire for transfer. Patient retains full decision-making capacity. Patient requests that all communication regarding potential transfer go through the hospital's legal counsel." She signed it with her credentials and hit save, and the timestamp read 5:41 p.m. From down the corridor, she heard voices the particular quality of a tense institutionals exchange, multiple parties, someone using the careful language of authority, being challenged by someone using the equally careful language of authority. That was not going to be moved. Forsyth, moving fast. Nora looked at Callahan. He looked back at her. He had the steadiness of a man who had faced worse, which was not the same as the steadiness of a man who wasn't afraid. And she recognized that difference because she was not unafraid either and was choosing to function anyway. "Whatever that paperwork says," she told him, "you don't have to go anywhere." "I know." He paused. "Go do what you need to do." She went. The admissions area was 40 feet from Bay 4, and she covered it in under 15 seconds. And what she found, when she got there, was Forsyth composed, folder already open, reading glasses on, facing 2 military police officers in uniform, and, behind them, Raymond Souza, who had finally dispensed with the pretense of reasonable conversation and replaced it with something Nora recognized as institutional force. And beside Souza, with the specific expression of a man who had made a decision he was not entirely comfortable with and had made it anyway, was Dr. Victor Hale. But Hale wasn't standing with Souza. He was standing between Souza and the admissions desk, blocking the path. He looked at Nora when she appeared, and his expression was complicated in the way that only mattered because of where he was standing, and where he was standing was on her side of the room, and that had not been the configuration this morning. And she noted it and filed it, and didn't have time for more than that. "The paperwork is an emergency classification review request," Forsyth was saying, in the precise, unhurried tone of someone who had read more federal documents than everyone else in the room combined. "It is not a court order. It is not a transfer authorization. It is a request directed to a federal regulatory body that has not yet been granted or reviewed. It confers no authority in this facility at this time." One of the military police officers, young, jaw tight, clearly uncertain about the legal terrain, said, "Ma'am, we have orders." You have a request document, Forsyth said. Your orders are based on an authority that doesn't yet exist. When it does, and if it's judicially validated, you're welcome to return. She closed her folder. Until then, my patient is in Bay 4 receiving treatment, and this facility is not authorizing access. Sousa looked past Forsyth, past Hale, past the desk. He looked directly at Nora. His expression had shed the last of the reasonable man architecture. What was underneath was not anger. It was something colder than anger, the look of someone who had held a lid down for a very long time and was running low on the energy required to keep holding it. You have no idea what you've opened, he said. Not a threat. A fact delivered with the flatness of someone who had already lived on the other side of it. I have a pretty good idea, Nora said. Sousa held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned to the officers. We'll continue this through the proper channels. He gestured toward the exit, and the three of them moved toward the ambulance bay doors. And Sousa paused once more at the threshold and looked back, and Nora met his eyes and did not look away. And then he was gone. The doors swung shut behind them. The admissions area was very quiet for a moment. Forsyth turned to Nora. The notebook, she said. My pocket. Give it to me. I'm going to have it formally entered into attorney-client protected evidence storage tonight. She held out her hand. Nora reached into her breast pocket and produced the notebook Graham Callahan's Admiral's memory, 20 minutes of specific detail in her own handwriting, and placed it in Forsyth's hand. Forsyth took it. She looked at Hale. Victor, I'm going to need your formal statement by 9 p.m. You'll have it, Hale said. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him. It was a brief exchange, unceremonious, the kind of moment that didn't announce itself as significant while it was happening, but would be in retrospect. Thank you, she said. Don't. He shook his head slightly. I should have listened to you. This morning. She didn't disagree, because the moment didn't need cushioning. 9 p.m., she said. Don't be late. She turned back toward the ER. Deborah was at the nurse's station, and she was not alone. Beside her, in a posture that Nora recognized immediately, the specific, contained stillness of someone who had just received significant news through an institutional channel and was now waiting for the next instruction, was a man in civilian clothes, bearing a government ID, clipped to his lapel that Nora had never seen before. Not DOD, a different seal. Blue and gold, with an eagle and a specific arrangement of stars that she had to look at twice before she recognized it, because it was not a seal she had expected to see in the ER of Cascade Valley Medical Center on a Tuesday afternoon. The Inspector General's office. The man looked at her. Nurse Whitaker? Yes, I'm Special Agent David Farrow, Dodd Office of Inspector General. We received a referral 30 minutes ago from Senator Marsh's office. He paused, and his voice was entirely professional, the flat precision of someone who had been sent to begin something rather than end it. I need to speak with you and Admiral Callahan, both of you. Tonight, from Bay 4 behind the curtain, there was a sound, a specific, deliberate sound, the kind made by a man who was not simply sitting in a hospital bed anymore. The sound of a wheelchair being repositioned, of a man making himself ready. Nora looked at Farrow. Give me 5 minutes, she said. She went to Bay 4 and pulled back the curtain, and what she saw stopped her for a half second before her clinical brain categorized it, and her clinical brain was wrong, because what was happening in Bay 4 was not a clinical event. Graham Callahan had moved himself from the bed to the wheelchair unassisted, which was not the remarkable part. The remarkable part was that his left foot, the foot whose toes had curled at 4 a.m., 4 hours and a lifetime ago, was pressed flat against the footrest of the chair with a muscular engagement that was visible even through his clothing, a deliberate, controlled, sustained contact that required exactly the kind of voluntary motor input that a complete spinal cord injury did not permit. He looked up at her. His face was tired and raw and more alive than it had been this morning. Who's out there? He said. Inspector General, she said. DOD, sent by Senator Marsh. He absorbed this. Then, Are we ready? She looked at him. At the foot on the footrest. At the 19 years of institutional silence that had just run out of room. Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A message from Vasanthan, 3 words and a link. It's already live. She clicked the link. A news site, not a major outlet, not yet, but the kind of verified investigative platform that the major outlets would be citing within the hour. The headline read, Abandoned Veterans, Secret Implants, and the program the Pentagon hoped you'd forget. The first photograph in the article was the MRI image Nora had shown Vasanthan in the consultation alcove that morning. The implant, isolated in contrast, glowing clean and intact. Below it the caption read, a device implanted in a living veteran, still functional after 14 years, in a program its administrators claimed was non-viable. Her phone began ringing before she could read the next paragraph. The call was from a number she didn't recognize. Area code 202, Washington. She let it ring. There would be more calls. There were already more calls. She could see the additional notifications stacking behind the first. All unknown numbers, all 202 area codes, the specific telephonic geography of institutional alarm. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at Callahan. Yes, she said. We're ready. The interview with Special Agent Farrow lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. It took place in the family consultation room, which was becoming the most consequential room in the building and it was conducted with a recorder running, a second agent present as witness, and Forsyth sitting beside Nora and Callahan, with the focused attention of someone cataloging every word for future legal use. Farrow was good at his job in the specific way that made him easy to underestimate, mild-mannered, methodical, asking questions in an order that seemed random but was clearly not, building a structure from the answers that he never made explicit, but that Nora could feel assembling beneath the surface of the conversation. He asked Callahan about the surgical facility, about the personnel, about the post-operative briefing and the phrase program integrity and the absence of any follow-up contact in 19 years. He asked Nora about her 3 years in the research division, about the discontinuation, about the peripheral stimulator and how it had come to be in her locker. He asked about Sousa, about Dreyer, about the monitoring facility that Vasanthan's source had confirmed was still operational. He didn't ask about the article. He didn't need to. By the time the interview reached its second hour, Nora's phone had accumulated 14 missed calls, and the hospital's main media line had, according to a text from the charge nurse on duty, crashed under the volume of incoming press inquiries. When Farrow finally stopped the recorder, he sat back in his chair and did something she hadn't expected. He looked tired, not performed tiredness, genuine tiredness, the kind that came from having been inside a situation like this before and knowing what the next several weeks were going to require. I want to be straight with you, he said, both of you. This investigation is going to be contested at every level. There are people with significant institutional interest in keeping Heliodor buried, and they have Heliodor buried, have resources and legal architecture that has been in place for years. It won't be fast, and it won't be clean. He looked at Callahan. Your cooperation is the foundation of this. Without your documented testimony, the program stays classified, and the evidence stays inaccessible. You have my testimony, Callahan said. His voice was flat and utterly certain. And the other patients, the ones still living. If we can identify them, contact them, document their situations. I'll help you find them, Nora said. Farrow nodded. He stood, gathered his materials with the careful economy of a man who had been doing this long enough not to waste motion. One more thing. Raymond Sousa was placed on administrative hold 40 minutes ago by the DoD Inspector General's office pending review. He's been asked to surrender his building access and communications devices. The room was quiet. Colonel Dreyer, Callahan said. The classification review request. Under review by the IG's office. It won't be granted tonight. Farrow paused at the door. I'd recommend both of you get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be significantly more complicated than today. He left. His second agent followed, pulling the door closed behind them. The three of them, Nora, Callahan, Forsyth, sat in the room for a moment, in the particular silence of people who have just finished something that is also the beginning of something else entirely. Sousa's on administrative hold, Callahan said, not with satisfaction, with the measured acknowledgement of a man who had learned to verify before reacting. It's not over, Nora said. No, he agreed, but it moved. Forsyth gathered her folder. I'm going to be in this building until midnight. If anything comes through legal channels, any court filings, any federal communications, anything with a seal, I need to be called immediately. She looked at Nora. Go home. Sleep 4 hours minimum. You'll be useless to him tomorrow if you're running on nothing. I'll try. Try harder than you usually do, Forsyth said and left. Nora drove home at 8:40 p.m. Her apartment was 6 minutes from the hospital, a proximity she had arranged deliberately when she took the job, because she had known, on some level, that the kind of nursing she did required short distances between where she was and where she might be needed. The apartment was small and somewhat cluttered, and smelled like the coffee she'd left on that morning, which now had the particular offensive coffee that had been sitting on a warm burner for 14 hours. So she turned the coffee maker off. She sat at her kitchen table. She did not sleep 4 hours or any hours, because her phone kept producing messages, and her mind kept producing the next version of the problem, the shape of what tomorrow had to look like if the day after tomorrow was going to hold. She was at the hospital by 6:15 a.m. Senator Darlene Marsh arrived at Cascade Valley Medical Center at 9:03 the following morning with 2 staff members, a security detail that waited in the lobby, and the unhurried certainty of a woman who had spent 30 years in Washington, learning to walk into rooms where people were expecting her, and immediately changed the room's center of gravity. She was in her mid-60s, silver-haired, with the kind of direct eye contact that was not aggressive but was absolutely unapologetic. She shook Nora's hand in the corridor outside Bay 4 with the grip of someone who used handshakes as information-gathering exercises. Nurse Whitaker, she said, I've read everything Priya sent me. I've also read your research publications from your Army tenure. The work on biological interface degradation rates was, she paused, significantly more sophisticated than what the program's official output records indicated. The official output records were selectively compiled, Nora said. I know. The senator's voice was perfectly even. I'd like to meet the Admiral. Callahan had spent the night in the hospital. His infection was responding to the antibiotics. His vitals were stable, and the clinical team was not yet ready to discuss discharge planning for a patient whose neurological situation had been reclassified as active and complex sometime in the previous 24 hours. Hale had been in at 7 a.m. with a physiatry consult already scheduled and a physical therapy assessment booked for 10:30. He had done this without being asked, which Nora noted without commenting on. Marsh sat across from Callahan for 40 minutes. Nora stood outside the bay, giving them the room, watching the ER run its morning through the curtain gap. Trauma, triage, the ordinary emergencies that kept arriving regardless of what was happening in Bay 4. A man with a hand injury, an elderly woman with chest pain, a child with a fever whose mother was translating for her in a language Nora didn't speak, and Nora called the translation service and handed the phone to the mother, and for those 4 minutes, she was simply a nurse doing a shift, which was both the most ordinary thing she had done in 2 days and the thing that felt most like herself. When Marsh came out of the bay, her expression had shifted, not softened, clarified. The look of someone who had been working from documents and had just been given the human version of the same information. He remembers the name of the lead anesthesiologist, she said. He has a very detailed memory, Nora said. That name matches a civilian contractor who was employed by a DoD research subsidiary from 2000 to 2011. Marsh's chief of staff, a lean, quick-moving man named Garrett, who had been taking notes since they arrived, looked up from his phone. We've been trying to identify that contractor for 3 months. Admiral Callahan was unconscious during most of the post-operative period, Nora said. But he heard the name used twice in a conversation between 2 staff members when they thought he was still sedated. Marsh looked at her with something that was not quite approval, but was in that neighborhood. We're holding a subcommittee hearing in 11 days, she said. I want Callahan to testify, and I want you to testify alongside him. I'm a nurse. You're a former Army research officer with direct program knowledge, clinical findings, and 11 years of continuity with the technology in question. Marsh's voice was matter-of-fact. You're exactly who the subcommittee needs to hear from. Nora thought about 11 days. She thought about what 11 days meant for the other patients, the 12 remaining Heliodor cohort members whose current status they didn't yet fully know, some of whom might be in the same situation as Callahan, some of whom might be worse. She thought about what 11 days meant for the investigation, for the classification review that had been blocked but had not been withdrawn, for the institutional machinery that had been managing Heliodor's suppression for 14 years and was currently adjusting to the new situation rather than surrendering. I'll testify, she said. The senator nodded. Garrett will be in touch with Forsyth about logistics. She started to move, then stopped. The article, Vasanthan's piece. It's been picked up by 6 national outlets as of this morning. The DIAD press office issued a statement at 7 a.m. characterizing the situation as she glanced at her phone. A preliminary review of outdated research protocols with no current patient safety implications. That's going to be a difficult position to maintain, Nora said. Deeply difficult, Marsh agreed and left. The next 4 days moved with the particular velocity of a situation that had exceeded the ability of any individual party to fully manage it. The Inspector General's investigation expanded. Farrow's team identified 9 of the 13 remaining cohort members through a combination of military records, VA database cross-referencing, and, in 3 cases, direct tips from family members who had seen Vasanthan's article and recognized descriptions that matched their own relatives' histories. Of the 9 identified patients, 4 were deceased. Of the 5 living, 3 were in assisted living or long-term care facilities. 1 was living independently with family support, and 1, a former Marine sergeant named Willis Okafor, 58, injured in 2003, was reportedly ambulatory with assistance, a fact that his medical record attributed entirely to partial injury classification, and that the IG's team now believed might be evidence of undocumented device function that had never been clinically assessed. Nora learned about Okafor on the 3rd day from Farrow in a phone call she took standing in the hospital parking lot because the staff room was too loud and the corridor had too many people. He's in Phoenix, Farrow said. His family is willing to bring him to Seattle for evaluation if this facility can host it. Talk to Hale, she said. He's been cooperative. Already have. Hales agreed. A pause. He also submitted a formal statement to the IG's office yesterday afternoon. His account of the Bay 4 assessment is comprehensive and consistent with yours. He included a self-critical addendum, noting that his initial dismissal of your clinical concern was not supported by available evidence. She absorbed that, did he? 7 pages. Single-spaced. She looked across the parking lot at the ambulance bay doors. He's a thorough man, she said. Also, Farrow continued, we've received confirmation from the DoD General Counsel's office that the classification review request filed by Colonel Dreyer has been rejected on procedural grounds. Dreyer has been placed on administrative leave, pending a separate review of his actions on the morning of the incident, specifically the monitoring alert system and its response protocols. Souza? Voluntary interview with the IG's office tomorrow morning. His legal counsel reached out this morning to indicate he's prepared to be. Pharaoh paused, choosing words cooperative, in exchange for certain considerations. Nora understood what that meant. A man who had been managing liability for 14 years, watching that management disintegrate in 4 days, making the calculation that cooperation was less costly than resistance. She did not feel satisfaction at this. She felt something flatter and more complicated, the recognition that institutions protected themselves through individuals, and that Sousa was now making the same calculation the institution had made when it shut down in Heliodor: minimize damage, contain the record, survive. It wasn't justice. Not yet. But it was movement. There's one more thing, Pharaoh said. Tell me, Robert Tanner's case file, the classified autopsy. He paused. We've obtained a federal court order for the classified evidence. The implant from the Tanner autopsy has been transferred to an independent forensic medical examiner for analysis. Another pause. The preliminary assessment indicates the device was functional at time of death. And Tanner's cause of death, listed as cardiac failure, secondary to prolonged immobility, is being reviewed in light of the finding that his spinal cord, like Callahan's, showed structural continuity at the injury level. The parking lot was very still around her. Someone was loading a patient into a transport vehicle 40 feet away, the ordinary motion of discharge, a person going home. She watched without seeing it. He could have walked, she said. Not a question. Possibly. The analysis isn't complete. But based on the device status and the cord presentation, it's being treated as a serious question. She ended the call and stood in the parking lot for another minute before going back inside. The physiatry team had formally established a rehabilitation program for Callahan by day 4. It was aggressive by standard protocol standards, daily stimulation sessions, building on what the peripheral device had initiated, manual physical therapy twice daily, progressive weight-bearing assessment in the parallel bars under PT supervision. The progress was not miraculous. Progress in spinal rehabilitation never was. It was incremental and uncertain and occasionally reversed itself for reasons that were physiologically explicable but emotionally brutal. What it was, however, was real. On day 4, Callahan supported 20% of his body weight in the parallel bars for 11 seconds before his left knee buckled and he caught himself on his arms. 11 seconds. The PT, a woman named Sandra Reyes, who had been doing this for 12 years, and to keep her clinical face on through most things, had to turn away and reorganize the equipment cart afterward in a way that fooled nobody. Nora wasn't present for that session. She found out about it from Callahan when she did his evening vitals, and he told her, in the same level voice he used for most things, and she said good in the same level voice, and they sat with that for a moment. Tanner, he said, the IG has his file. His daughter? The investigative team has made contact. She's been informed that the case is being formally reviewed. Nora set down the blood pressure cuff. She's been fighting for this for 3 years. Callahan was quiet for a moment. He was a good soldier. I looked him up after you told me. Read what I could find. He paused. He deserved better than a classification order and a closed file. Yes, she said. Is it going to be enough? What Pharaoh's team has? She looked at him directly. I think so. Between the forensic analysis, Sousa's cooperation, the subcommittee hearing, and the 5 living patients who are now in the IG's documentation, yes. I think it's enough. You think? 75%. He looked at her. Better odds than before. On day 6, Sousa's interview with the IG produced something no one had anticipated. In the course of providing his account negotiated, limited, carefully framed by his legal counsel Sousa, disclosed the existence of a secondary archive. Not the official Heliodor records, which had been partially declassified through the IG's court order, but a separate documentation set maintained by Sousa personally that contained the complete clinical outcome data for all 14 cohort members through the date of the program's discontinuation. He had kept it, not out of conscience, His legal counsel was very clear about that framing, and nobody entirely believed it, but it didn't matter why he had kept it. What mattered was that it existed, and that it contained, for each of the 14 patients, the full clinical record, including the nature of their cord injuries, the implant specifications, the projected function restoration timeline the research team had calculated before the program was shut down, and, most critically, the internal memos documenting the DoD leadership's knowledge that the devices remained functional post-discontinuation. The archive also contained 3 memos from 2011, 2014 specifically discussing Robert Tanner by name, noting his deteriorating health and recommending against any clinical intervention on the grounds that re-engagement with the patient population would resurface program liability. The recommendation had been approved twice. Farrow called Nora at 7 p.m. on day 6. His voice was professionally flat in the way that meant he was managing something significant. The secondary archive changes the scope, he said. This is no longer an administrative misconduct investigation. We're looking at willful medical negligence resulting in preventable harm and potentially contributing to a preventable death. She sat down on the edge of her kitchen table. Criminal charges. The DoD General Counsel is meeting with the Department of Justice tomorrow morning. A pause. The individuals named in the approval, Memos Sousa, Dreyer, and 2 others, whose names are new to the file, are being formally identified as subjects rather than witnesses. She processed this. Sousa cooperated. His cooperation provided the archive. It does not insulate him from what the archive contains. Farrow's voice was even. He may have calculated that wrong. She spent a long time looking at the kitchen wall after she hung up. The pattern of it, ordinary and unchanged, the small things a person's eyes absorbed in a place they had lived long enough for it to stop looking like anything. She thought about the memos, about the phrase resurface program liability in a document discussing a man who was getting sicker and could have been helped. She thought about the distance between the language of institutional management and the reality of Robert Tanner sitting in his chair while people who knew he didn't have to be sitting in it signed papers to keep him there. She thought about the 11 seconds in the parallel bars. She went to bed at 10:30 and slept 6 hours, which was the most she had slept in a week. The subcommittee hearing was 8 days out when the hospital board convened its own formal review of the situation. By then, Cascade Valley Medical Center had become something it had not been 2 weeks earlier, a named location in a national news story, the place where a retired admiral's toes had moved for the first time in 19 years. The hospital where a Quiet R nurse had kept a piece of equipment in her locker for 11 years on the theory that someone might eventually need it. The board review was not a hearing. It was an internal audit covering the events of the morning of the incident, Hale's initial response, the risk management call, the decision to involve legal counsel, and the subsequent handling of the DoD personnel. Nora was asked to provide a full written account, which she did over the course of 2 evenings, 17 pages, every clinical decision documented against the reasoning behind it. The board's preliminary finding, issued on day 8, was that Nora Whitaker had acted within her clinical authority, had exercised appropriate judgment in applying specialized knowledge to patient care, and had correctly identified a situation that required institutional response. The finding also noted that the initial response by the facility's risk management function had been insufficiently patient-centered and recommended a protocol review. It did not notably find any fault with her use of the peripheral stimulator. She was told about the finding by the board chair, Theodore Burwell, in a conversation that lasted 6 minutes and was conducted in the corridor outside his office because both of them had other places to be. The board is recommending a commendation, Burwell said. Formal, with documentation in your personnel file. I'd prefer a protocol update for veteran and patient intake, she said. He looked at her. You'll get both. On day 9, Willis Okafor arrived at Cascade Valley Medical Center from Phoenix with his wife and his eldest son. He was 58 and broad-shouldered, and he arrived in a motorized wheelchair that he operated with the practiced efficiency of someone who had adapted comprehensively. His wife had his medical records in a folder that was 3 inches thick and had the particular worn quality of something consulted and reconsulted over years. Nora was not his nurse. He had been formally assigned to the rehabilitation team that Hale's department had assembled. But she was there when he arrived because Hale had asked her to be there in the specific way that meant he understood. This was her case in a sense that went beyond the clinical assignment. Okafor looked at her across the admissions area and said, "You're the one who turned the thing on." "I'm the one who found the first one," she said. He nodded slowly. He looked around the admissions area with the careful attention of a man assessing unfamiliar terrain. "They told me for 20 years it was a partial injury, that the function I still had was natural recovery. We're going to assess what's natural and what isn't," she said. "It'll take time." "I've got time," he said. His voice was dry and very steady. "I've had nothing but time." His wife reached over and took his hand, and he let her without looking at her, and the not looking was as much information as anything else in the room. The IG team's formal identification of the archive's 4 named subjects went through Department of Justice channels on day 10. The announcement was administrative in tone and said very little subjects under investigation. Charges pending review, names withheld pending formal indictment, but the names were not withheld for long because the DOD press office attempts to manage the information environment functional capacity were operating the 4 functional capacity, and by evening, the 4 names were confirmed by 3 separate news organizations. Raymond Souza was one of them. The others were 2 former DOD Research Division directors, whose names Nora recognized from the Heliodor program's early years, and a 4th name, a civilian contractor, whose involvement she had not known about, and whose name she did not recognize, and whose role, according to the reporting, had been the management of the classifieds monitoring system. Someone had been paid for 14 years to watch the device signatures of 14 patients and not act. The story ran on every major network that evening. Cascade Valley Medical Center was in every version of it. So was Nora's name. She watched exactly 4 minutes of the coverage before turning off her television and making tea she didn't drink, sitting at her kitchen table with the quiet of someone who has been inside an event for long enough that seeing it from the outside felt like watching something that had happened to a different person. The following morning was the day before the subcommittee hearing. She was in the ER at 6:30, running a normal shift, because the ER did not adjust its schedule for national news cycles, and she had 3 open patients and a 4th incoming, and she was in the process of reviewing labs on her 2nd patient when Deborah appeared at her shoulder and said, in the low, specific tone that meant something was happening that required immediate attention, "Bay 6. Now, Nora went. The patient in Bay 6 was not on her roster. She had not been assigned to the patient. But she looked at him when she pushed through the curtain and understood immediately why Deborah had come to find her specifically. He was in his late 60s, white-haired, a spinal injury patient, transported from a long-term care facility in Oregon, admitted for respiratory complications. The transport paperwork listed his injury date as 2002. His name was Thomas Garland. She had cross-referenced the Heliodor cohort list twice at Pharaoh's request in the past week. Thomas Garland was patient number 7. She looked at the back of his neck, at the hairline, at the specific location she had learned to look, the precise configuration she had recognized on Graham Callahan 9 days earlier. The scar was there. She reached for her phone. She called Pharaoh. Then she called Hale. Then she put the phone in her pocket and stood at the foot of Thomas Garland's bed and looked at the man who was the 7th patient from a program that had tried very hard to stay buried, who had arrived in her ER on the morning. before the hearing that was going to expose it, which was either the worst timing imaginable or the best. Thomas Garland opened his eyes and looked at her. "Good morning," he said. His voice was thin from the respiratory issue, but his eyes were focused and alert. "Are you my nurse?" She looked at him, at his scar, at the closed door behind her, and the ER running its morning on the other side of it, and the hearing tomorrow, and the archive with the memos, and Callahan's foot on the footrest, and Robert Tanner's daughter, who had been fighting for 3 years, and the peripheral stimulator in her locker 6 rooms down. "Yes," she said. "I'm your nurse. My name is Nora Whitaker." She pulled the rolling stool to his bedside. "Before we talk about your breathing, I need to ask you a few questions about your injury." He looked at her with the particular stillness of a man, persillness of a man who had been in the medical system for a long time and knew when a conversation was about to change direction. "What kind of questions?" he said. "The kind that start with," she paused, choosing the words carefully, the words that had changed everything 9 days ago, and were about to do it again. "Do you know if you had any surgery beyond your initial spinal stabilization?" Thomas Garland looked at the ceiling, then back at her. "There was something," he said slowly, "after the initial surgery. A second procedure. They said it was necessary. They said it was standard." He paused. "I asked for documentation afterward. They said it was classified." Nora's hand was steady on the stool armrest. "Mr. Garland," she said, "I need to do a physicals assessment. And then I need to make some calls." She was reaching for her stethoscope when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Pharaoh. A text, not a call. 3 lines that she read in under 4 seconds. "Sousa's attorney just contacted us. Client wants to revise his cooperation agreement. He says there's a name he didn't give us. Claims this name is the person who made the final call on Tanner in 2014, the memo approval that kept him from getting treatment. This person is still in active federal service. Client says this person is scheduled to testify at the subcommittee hearing tomorrow." She read Pharaoh's text twice. Then she put the phone face down on the supply tray, beside Thomas Garland's bed, and said, "I'll be right back," and stepped outside the bay. The ER corridor was running its morning. Carts, personnel, the ordinary controlled motion of a shift in progress. She stood in the middle of it for exactly 4 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed herself before she made the call. Pharaoh picked up on the first ring. "The name," she said. "Do you have it?" "Sousa's attorneys submitted it 20 minutes ago. It's being verified now." Pharaoh's voice was careful in the specific way that meant he was managing information. He wasn't entirely certain how to characterize yet. "The individual in question is Brigadier General Harold Voss, currently serving as Deputy Director of the Defense Health Agency. He is scheduled to testify before the subcommittee tomorrow morning as a character witness for the DOD's position that the Heliodor program was discontinued for legitimate scientific reasons." Nora pressed her back against the corridor wall. Around her, the ER continued. Nobody looked at her. She was just a nurse standing in a hallway. "He signed the 2014 memo," she said. "Both the 2011 and 2014 memos, according to Sousa's revised statement. His name was redacted from the versions we initially received through the court order. The unredacted originals are what Sousa's attorney provided this morning. He was going to sit in front of Senator Marsh's subcommittee and testify on the DOD's behalf." Yes, she thought about what that meant. A man who had signed the paperwork keeping Robert Tanner from treatment, preparing to walk into a Senate hearing and characterize the program as a legitimate scientific endeavor that had simply run its course. Not lying, exactly the kind of institutional testimony that was technically accurate in its individual components and catastrophically dishonest in its totality. "What happens now?" she said. "Senator Marsh's office has been notified. The subcommittee is convening an emergency pre-hearing review this afternoon to assess the new material." Pharaoh paused. "Voss has not yet been formally notified that he's a subject rather than a witness." "That happens today. through DoD channels once verification is complete. How long is verification? 3 hours, maybe 4. Thomas Garland is in Bay 6, she said. He's patient number 7. He arrived last night from Oregon. A silence. I'll have someone there within the hour. She went back into Bay 6. Garland was watching the ceiling with the patient attention of a man who had spent a long time in medical facilities learning to exist inside waiting. She sat on the stool and did his respiratory assessment. His lungs were not... The pneumonia was early stage and responding already to the antibiotics that had been started on admission. His vitals were more stable than the transport paperwork had suggested. He was going to be all right, at least in the immediate sense of that phrase. When she finished, he looked at her and said, "You know what the thing in my neck is?" "Yes," she said. "How long have you known that it was there?" "I've known that implant's like it existed for 11 years, she said. "I've known yours specifically was there for approximately 20 minutes. He absorbed this with the stillness of a man who had already done most of his processing of unexpected information long ago and had developed efficient systems for accommodating new versions of it. "They told me the second surgery was a stabilization procedure," he said. "I was 23 years old, and I had just been told I would never walk again." "I didn't ask the right questions. You asked for documentation," she said. "They told you it was classified. That's not a failure of questions. That's a failure of everyone else in that room." He looked at her. He was the kind of tired that lived in the body, rather than the eyes, the exhaustion of years of managed dependency, of systems designed for his care that had also, in some fundamental sense, been designed to manage him. "Is it still working?" he said. "The thing in my neck." "I don't know yet," she said. "I'd like to find out." His wife had stepped out to find coffee. It was just the two of them in Bay 6, and she reached for the padded case that was not a blood pressure kit, which she had been carrying in her bag since the morning after the incident with Callahan, because she had stopped leaving it in the locker, and she held it in her hands and looked at him. "This is a peripheral stimulator," she said. "It interfaces with the implant. If the device is still functional, your legs may respond to the signal." She paused, making sure he understood the full shape of what she was saying. "Or they may not. I don't want you to expect something, and then minus..." "Do it," he said. The same 2 words Callahan had used. She wondered if there was something about 20 years of being told your body was finished that made a person reach the same stripped-down clarity when offered the alternative. She calibrated the stimulator. She placed the electrodes. She powered it on at the lowest amplitude and watched his face. For 6 seconds, nothing happened. She increased the amplitude. Thomas Garland's right thigh moved, not dramatically. Not the cinematic restoration of something lost. A muscle contraction, visible, voluntary adjacent, real in a leg that had been classified as permanently non-functional since 2002. His breath caught. She watched his eyes and saw the same thing she had seen in Callahan's eyes, that interior earthquake that had no external sound. Is that his voice broke on the second word. He stopped and reset. "Is that what I think it is?" "Yes," she said. He put his hand over his mouth and stared at his leg, and did not say anything else for a while, and she did not fill the silence, because it wasn't her silence to fill. The IG team member arrived 40 minutes later, and Nora handed off the documentation, and she went back to her other patients, and she did her shift, and at 2:30, Farrow texted her 3 words, "Voss is confirmed." The pre-hearing review that afternoon ran for 3 hours and produced a formal amendment to the subcommittee's witness list. Voss was removed as a character witness and added to the list of individuals under active investigation, effective immediately. His notification was handled through DoD legal channels at 4:15 p.m., which meant that by 4:16 p.m. he knew that the hearing he had prepared to attend as a supporter of the institutional position had become something else entirely. Senator Marsh called Nora at 5:30. "Tomorrow is going to be substantial," she said. which was the kind of understatement that carried the weight of a more complete description. I know. How are you? It was an unexpected question. Not from a senator to a witness, from one person to another, with the genuine directness of someone who had seen enough of these situations to know that the people at the center of them often didn't get asked. Nora thought about how she was. She was tired. She had a patient in Bay 4 who had stood in the parallel bars for 11 seconds 3 days ago. She had a patient in Bay 6 whose right thigh had moved 40 minutes ago. She had been carrying a piece of equipment in a padded case for 11 years, and she had stopped wondering why she kept it, because she knew now, and the knowing was not triumphant, it was just true, the way things that had been building for a long time felt when they finally arrived. "I'm okay," she said. "I'll be better when it's over." "It won't entirely be over tomorrow," Marsh said. "That's not what hearings do. What they do is make the next part possible." "I know," Nora said. "I'll take it." The hearing convened at 9 a.m. in a Senate committee room that was standing room only, which was not the usual condition of a subcommittee session on veterans' medical oversight. The press section was full. The public gallery was full. 3 of the 4 major networks had cameras in the pool positions. Priya Vasanthan was in the press section with a notebook open and a recorder on the table in front of her and the expression of someone who had been building toward this for 8 months and was watching it arrive. Graham Callahan testified first. He had been transported to Washington by the VA's Adaptive Transport Service, a process that had taken considerable coordination, and he sat submitting in his wheelchair, in his dress uniform retired, but worn with the full weight of its history, and he spoke for 47 minutes, in the voice of a man who had been waiting 19 years to say what he was saying, and had decided that when the moment came, he was going to say it clearly, without drama, without performance, with the particular authority of someone who simply knew what had happened to him and was no longer willing to let other people provide the official version. He described the ambush, the injury, the facility he had woken up in, the post-operative briefing, the phrase program integrity, the 19 years of specialists and closed doors in management. And he described the morning in Bay 4 at Cascade Valley Medical Center, what the nurse had found, what the stimulator had done, what the MRI had shown, describing all of it in the flat, factual register of a military officer giving a mission debrief, which was the most devastating way to tell that particular story. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms get when they have absorbed something that can't be immediately processed. Senator Marsh said, "Admiral Callahan, you were told for 19 years that your spinal cord was completely severed." "Yes, ma'am." "You now know that it was not." "Yes, ma'am." "And during those 19 years, you had an implanted device in your neck that might have been able to restore some of your function, and no one ever told you it was there." "That is correct." Marsh looked at the other subcommittee members. Then she looked at the DOD representative seated at the secondary table, 2 of them, both of whom had the expressions of people who had prepared for a version of this hearing that no longer existed. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. "Your testimony will be entered into the permanent record." Nora testified second. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things, not by rehearsing what she wanted to say, but by getting very clear on what was true and deciding to say that without modification. She sat before the subcommittee in her civilian clothes, no uniform, no institutional affiliation beyond her name and her nursing license, and her 3 years in a classified research program that everyone in the room now knew about. And she walked through the clinical findings with the precision of someone who understood that precision was her most powerful tool. She described the stimulator assessment, the MRI findings, her conversation with Souza in the elevator, the monitoring facility, Robert Tanner's classified autopsy, Thomas Garland's presentation 2 days earlier, the 14 patients, what had been done to them, what had been known and not acted upon. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The subcommittee members asked questions for an hour and 20 minutes. Some of the questions were technical, about the device and the physiology, and she answered those with the specificity of a researcher who had spent 3 years studying exactly this. Some were institutional, about the decision-making chain and who had known what and when, and she answered those with the specificity of a woman who had spent 2 weeks reading every document the IG's team had shared with her. One of the subcommittee members, a senator from Virginia older who had been quiet through most of the morning, asked her a question that was different from the others. "Nurse Whitaker," he said, "you kept this device in your locker for 11 years. You didn't file a complaint. You didn't contact a congressional office. You didn't go to the press. Why?" She looked at him. It was a fair question. It deserved a real answer. "Because I didn't have a patient," she said. "I had knowledge, and I had a piece of equipment, and I had 11 years of being aware that somewhere people who had been in that program were living in situations that might not have been necessary. But without a patient in front of me, without a clinical event, I could document and verify everything I had was classified memory, and a device that had no official existence." She paused. "The system is designed that way. It makes it very hard to act on what you know without something you can prove. And the only way to prove it was for someone to walk into my ER." The senator was quiet for a moment, and when someone did, "I looked at him," she said. "That's all. I just looked at him, the way I would look at any patient." The room was quiet again. Marsh leaned forward. "I want to ask you one more question, and I want you to answer it as directly as you've answered everything else today." She looked at Nora steadily. "What do you want to happen now?" Nora thought about this. She thought about Callahan in the parallel bars, about Garland's thigh and the sound of his breath catching, about the 5 living patients and the 4 who had died, and Robert Tanner's daughter, who had been fighting a classified wall for 3 years. She thought about the 9 and the 4 and the 1 in the evidence locker, and the memos with the language about liability management, and Souza in the elevator telling her she had no idea what she'd opened. "I want every remaining patient from the Heliodor cohort evaluated within 6 days," she said, "by a clinical team that has no institutional conflict of interest. I want a veteran rehabilitation program established with the specific capacity to assess and treat spinal cord injury patients who may have received experimental interventions during their military services. I want Robert Tanner's cause of death formally amended to reflect the findings of the independent forensic review. And I want his daughter to receive an official apology from the Department of Defense in writing, delivered personally by someone with the authority to mean it." She paused. "And I want it done this year," she said. "Not after an 18-month review cycle. This year." The DoD representatives at the secondary table were conferring quietly. Their body language had the quality of people making calculations about what was still salvageable. Harold Voss was not in the room. He had been formally removed from his position as Deputy Director of the Defense Health Agency the previous afternoon, pending criminal referral. The notification had been simultaneous with the notification that he was a subject of investigation rather than a witness, which meant he had found out both things at once in the same document, with no interval in which to manage his response. This was not an accident of timing. Marsh's office had coordinated it deliberately. The hearing ended at 1:17 p.m. The formal record would take time, the investigation would take time, the prosecutions would take time, the institutional reform would take more time than any of them wanted it to take, because these things always did. But the record was now permanent and public, and it existed in a way that could not be reclassified or sealed, because the archived video of a Senate subcommittee hearing was a different category of document from a classified internal memo, and 14 names were in it, and one of them was Robert Tanner, and that mattered in a way that was independent of outcome and timeline. After the hearing, in the corridor outside the committee room, Callahan found her in the crowd. He was in his chair, his dress uniform still perfect, and around them the room was dispersing into the organized motion of post-hearing departure staff, press, observers, the machinery of Washington reassembling itself around the next thing on its schedule. He looked at her with the expression she had first seen in Bay 4 when his toes had moved, the one that was too large and meant too complicated to fit inside normal emotional vocabulary, and she looked back at him the same way. Sandra says another 3 weeks in the parallel bars before we try steps, he said. Sandra's usually right. She's annoyingly right. He paused. I want to walk at the veterans' ceremony in March. Reyes says it's possible. I want it documented that I told you about it before it happened. Documented, she said. He held out his hand. She shook it, and it was a strange gesture between them by that point, too formal for what they had been through together, but also somehow exactly right, two people who had been through something, and were marking the fact of it with the only gesture that had been built for exactly that. Thank you, he said. She didn't say you're welcome, because you're welcome wasn't the right response to something that had rearranged the structure of 11 years of her life. She said, take care of your legs, which made him make the sound that might have been a laugh. And then the crowd moved, and he was gone. Priya Vasanthan appeared at her shoulder 30 seconds later, with a recorder in her hand and a question forming on her face, and Nora said, give me a week, and Vasanthan said, 5 days, and Nora said, fine. And they shook hands with the economy of two people who had already established the terms of a relationship, of a working relationship, under considerably more pressurized conditions than a corridor in a Senate office building. She flew back to Spokane that evening. The plane was half empty, and the flight took 2 hours and 12 minutes, and she slept for 93 of them, which was not exactly restful, but was something. She was back at Cascade Valley Medical Center the following morning at 6:30. The formal outcomes came over the following 6 weeks in the incremental, administrative way of institutional processes that moved slowly even when they were moving in the right direction. The DoD Inspector General issued a formal report. The Department of Justice filed criminal charges against Harold Voss, Raymond Souza, and 2 other named individuals. The charges included willful medical negligence, obstruction of a federal health program, and, in Voss's case, making materially false statements in the context of his attempted Senate testimony, a charge that had been added after the Souza disclosure, and that carried its own significant weight. The criminal process would take time, and it would not be clean, and defense attorneys were already constructing arguments about chain of command and institutional procedure, and the particular geography of responsibility that large organizations use to distribute and dilute accountability. But the charges were filed, and they were filed in public, and they carried names. The 4 deceased cohort members received formal, posthumous case reviews. Robert Tanner's cause of death was amended to cardiac failure, with contributing factors related to preventable neurological immobility secondary to a failure of clinical follow-up. The language was precise and cold and bureaucratic and entirely accurate. His daughter, whose name was Claudette Tanner, received an official letter from the Secretary of Defense, hand-delivered, which she described in a brief public statement as 22 years overdue and the beginning of something, not the end. She was right about that distinction, and Nora respected her for making it. The Heliodor Veteran Restoration Program was formally established inside the VA system 8 weeks after the hearing, with a charter that mandated evaluation of all identified cohort members within 60 days. It was underfunded in its initial allocation, which required Marsh's office to submit a supplementary budget request, which cleared the relevant committee after a second round of testimony. The program was named for no one and nothing in particular, which Nora considered correct. Programs named after the crises they arose from tended to spend their institutional energy commemorating the past rather than doing the work of the present. Willis Okafor completed his initial evaluation at Cascade Valley and was transferred to the VA program with a treatment plan that Hale's team had drafted and that Nora had reviewed at Hale's request. His device was functional. His cord was, like Callahan's, structurally continuous at the injury level. His prognosis was described as guarded but genuinely promising, which was the kind of medical language that meant there was real work ahead and the work was worth doing. Thomas Garland was discharged from Cascade Valley. After 10 days, the respiratory issue resolved, the Heliodor evaluation completed, his case transferred to the VA program with the full documentation that should have existed 21 years earlier. When he left, he shook Nora's hand and said, "I asked for documentation once. They told me it was classified." He paused. "This time, I got 17 pages. "Keep them," she said. "I will," he said. "Every single one." Victor Hale was not the same doctor he had been on the morning that Graham Callahan's toes had moved. This was not a transformation, because transformations were for stories that needed people to be different from one version to the next as a matter of plot. What had happened to Hale was more ordinary and more real. A man who had been wrong, had seen that he was wrong, and had made a series of subsequent choices that were different from the choices he had made when he was wrong. He was still difficult to work with in certain respects. He still used his position as a form of shorthand rather than explaining himself when he was in a hurry. But the board had added him to the leadership team of the Heliodor program evaluation, and he had accepted, and his work on it was meticulous in the way that suggested he understood what he was making up for without anyone having to say so directly. Nora did not pretend this constituted a full accounting. Some things remained unaccounted for, and that was the nature of real situations rather than resolved ones. She worked with it. 6 weeks after the hearing, on a morning in March that was overcast and cold in the way that Spokane mornings in March frequently were, Cascade Valley Medical Center held a small ceremony in its main auditorium. The occasion was the formal establishment of the hospital's Veteran Neurological Assessment Protocol, a new intake procedure that applied to all veteran patients with spinal injury histories, mandating a specific physical assessment sequence and a records review process that would, in the future, catch what had been missed for 19 years. The room held about 140 people. Clinical staff, board members, a handful of press, Farrow and 2 members of his team, Forsyth, Deborah Okonkwo in the 3rd row, with her arms crossed, and her expression suggesting she would believe the protocol was real when she had personally implemented it 3 times and not before. Graham Callahan was there. He walked into the room on a cane. Not independently, he had a physical therapist at his right side, who was close enough to catch him if something gave way, but not close enough to constitute support. His gait was slow and required visible concentration, and it was not the walk of a man who had recovered. It was the walk of a man who was recovering, which was a different and considerably more honest thing, and which was, to Nora's eye, the most accurate depiction of what the past 2 months had actually meant. The room understood what it was seeing. There was no dramatic moment of recognition, no collective gasp. People just went quiet, the way people went quiet in the presence of something they hadn't expected and didn't have an immediate category for. And Callahan walked to the front of the room and turned around and looked at all of them. And he said, in the voice of a man who had learned to be economical with the things that mattered most, I'm not going to make a speech. I'm just going to say that for 19 years, I was told a story about my body that wasn't true. And then someone looked at me, really looked, and the story changed. He paused. That's what this is for. So it doesn't take 19 years next time. He sat down. Marsh spoke briefly, remotely connected. Remotely connected, her voice through the auditorium speakers is carrying the specific authority of someone who was already working on the next version of the problem. Hale spoke about the clinical protocol. Forsyth spoke about the legal framework. Several other people spoke about things that were true and necessary. Nora did not speak. She had been asked to and had declined, not out of modesty, but because everything she would have said had already been said through the clinical record and the testimony, the 17 pages Thomas Garland was keeping, and the parallel bars and the 5 patients who were being treated, and the 4 who would receive the posthumous accounting they should have had while they were still alive. She had spent 11 years keeping a piece of equipment in her locker and not saying anything. And then she had spent 2 months saying everything, and now she was ready to go back to the part she had always been best at, which was the work itself. After the ceremony, in the corridor, Deborah found her. "You turned down the military research appointment," Deborah said. It was not a question. The news had circulated through the hospital 2 days earlier, an offer from the Defense Health Agency's newly restructured research division, a senior clinical research position, significant salary, significant title. "Yes," Nora said. "Why?" Nora looked down the corridor. At the end of it, past the nursing station and the medication room and the supply closet and the elevator, were the doors to the ER. Through the small window in those doors, she could see the edge of the admissions desk and the corner of the triage station and the first 3 feet of the hallway that led to the bays, where at any moment, through the ambulance entrance or the walk-in doors or the transfer vans from the care facilities around the city, another patient was going to arrive who needed someone to actually look at them. "Because this is where the patients are," she said. Deborah looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman who had been doing this job for 17 years and understood without requiring further explanation. She nodded once, the way people nodded when something was settled, and then she turned toward the nursing station and said, over her shoulder, "Bay 3 is yours. Chest pain, 61-year-old male. Came in 20 minutes ago." Nora was already moving. She pushed through the doors to the ER. The morning opened up around her, the sound of it, the pace of it, the particular quality of a room full of people doing hard work under pressure, which was not glamorous and was not clean and was not the version of medicine that appeared in the places Medicine was celebrated, but which was the version that actually existed, where real people arrived with real problems and needed someone who would not look away. She turned the corner into Bay 3. The man in the bed was gray-faced and scared in the way people got scared when their chest was doing something unfamiliar, and he looked at her when she came in with the specific relief of someone who needed help and had just seen it arrive. "Good morning," she said. "I'm Nora Whitaker. I'll be your nurse today." She opened the bay curtain all the way, pulled the stool to his bedside and started asking the questions that needed asking, and she listened to his answers with the full attention of someone who had learned not recently, but reinforced by everything that had happened in the past 2 months, that the most important clinical instrument in any room was also the simplest one. You actually looked, and sometimes, if you knew what you were looking for and you had the courage to act on what you found, 19 years of silence could move in a single morning, and a man's toes could curl, and the things that had been buried could finally come into the light where they belonged.